The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight.
So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm Charles Christian and with me is Janie. This is episode 33, the 13th of September edition of the Weird Tales Radio Show podcast, available on iTunes and all the usual podcast platforms. And now here's Janie with news of this month's featured haunting.
Yes, now, the location is Pennis Lane, with a double N, in the Kent village of Fawkham Green, which is said to be haunted by the ghost of a nun. And she's been seen floating down the lane on an autumn evening. And there are reports of screams heard in the night. Not very nice. The story is the nun was sexually attacked and murdered by a group of men, and for reasons not explained, the skull is said to be stored in the attic of a nearby house, and that bad luck will befall anyone who removes it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The legend says concerned villagers wanted to give the nun's skull a Christian burial, not surprisingly, and buried it in the local churchyard, but soon afterwards, ghostly disturbances started taking place within the village. So much so that the villagers dug the skull up and returned it to the attic, where apparently it remains to this day. Yeah.
That's a bit of a weird one because there's, if you recall, as you did the proofreading on it.
Yes, it's coming back to me, actually.
In my book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, The Mysterious Wold-Newton Triangle, there's a well-known ghost story associated with a skull in the Burton Agnes Hall stately home near Bridlington.
Was it a nun's skull?
It wasn't a nun's skull. It was one of the daughters of the house who was, quote-unquote, murderously attacked and robbed by outlaws, which I think nowadays would be described as a violent mugging, and subsequently died of her injuries. But before she died, she made her sisters promise that when she was dead, her head would be severed and kept in the family home forever. According to one version of the tale, she actually asked for her head to be preserved and kept on a table in the building's main hall.
That's a nice, charming sight when you walk in for a cup of tea with Lady Muck.
Yes. Anyway, realising she was delirious, to pacify her, the sisters agreed to her request. But when she died, she was buried in the nearby churchyard, quite reasonably. And at first, nothing happened, but then trouble started, and there were strange moanings and weird sounds. And then the ghost, known for some reason as Old Nancy, was seen walking the corridors and rooms of the hall. And in another quote, making the sisters' lives a burden to them and ensuring no servants would stay overnight in the hall. Apparently they put up with this for about 2 years, but after consulting the local parson, agreed that the grave should be opened. According to one version of the story, the sisters had the body decapitated and the head stored as requested. However, according to another version, the head had already become attached from the body and turned into a fleshless skull. Either way, the skull was brought into the hall and placed upon the table. After that, apparently the hall was peaceful and the nights untroubled by ghostly manifestations, except when anybody tried to move the skull. Apparently one incident, some 100 years later, it was buried in the garden, whereupon Old Nance started haunting the hall, and on another occasion a maid threw the skull out of a window, where it landed on a wagon standing outside the hall, causing the horses to rear up, and the whole house shook so much that pictures fell off the wall. Both times, peace was only restored when the skull was retrieved and placed back on the table. And in later years, the skull came to be regarded as a form of luck or magical talisman, guaranteeing that as long as it was left undisturbed, nothing bad would ever befall Burton Agnes Hall or the family who lived there. Anyway, to prevent accidents or anybody mischievously moving the skull, the family subsequently had a special niche constructed for it in a wall and then concealed the skull behind wood panelling in one of the rooms. And the location of this is a secret known only to the family who still live there and their most trusted staff.
Whew, I wonder if they put that down in the particulars of sale when they come to sell it.
Yes.
All fine here. Just
Yes.
don't go behind that panel and find the skull and chuck it out because the house will shake. Oops.
Yes. Dear, there is a sitting tenant.
Yeah.
For our big interview, we are continuing our theme of neo-paganism, and we're talking to writer and journalist Brendan Keane about Celtic Revivalism and the links between Gaelic mythology, the Roman Catholic Church, the history of Ireland, and even touching upon such things as the Arthurian legends and fairy folk.
My name is Brendan Keane, and I'm a writer, and I have an interest in Celtic mythology.
You were talking about the fact that there's a sort of difference between the English perspective of history, mythology, and the Celtic, in particular the Irish perspective when it comes on to paganism. We basically make stuff up and have our own perspective, but it tends not to be in line even with, never mind the rest of the world, but even with other peoples within the British Isles.
Yeah, I think it's generally you might say that about all European nations that explored paganism as part of the Romantic movement that we could associate with Beethoven or earlier than that. But there was that movement in the 19th century to address the religious wars of Protestantism and Catholicism with a rooted sense of the aristocratic, but also the local or pagan or national. And so the creativity that represents is maybe not anthropological, but is also anthropological. And if you were to compare that work continentally and then to what the British and the Irish do, there's some very interesting differences between the way the English address paganism and the way the Irish have done.
Can you spell that out in a bit more detail?
Well, I don't know if there's a simple theory for the national difference between English paganism and Irish paganism. They converge and diverge, as we know. There was a writer once described Ireland is often said to be England's fairyland, but really England is Ireland's fairyland, and the relationship is it's the constant relationship between Greece and Rome, between what the Irish Orpheus, his name is Carolan, he described it as She Beag She Mór, which in Gaelic means the big fairy mound and the small fairy mound. And so the relationship is often of the empire to the small people. The empire strikes back to the Jedi.
Yes.
And so paganism and the Celtic revivalism, it falls into that matrix.
So what we have in England, a possibly more artificial approach to it. We see it as a bit of ye olde worldy traditional folklore and very cute, but it's taken more seriously in Ireland.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that goes to the relationship of both nations to the Hanoverian dynasty. England takes a sort of post-indigenous view when the Glorious Revolution replaces the Stuarts.
Yeah.
I mean, we describe the Glorious Revolution as the synthesis of Hanoverian and Stuart because Queen Anne, but she really was the last Stuart in a way, and she never really had issue. So the idea of the Gaelicness of the English court, or the indigenous quality of it, which was represented by Stuart Gaelic accoutrement and origins, was sort of lost to England, but not just lost, it was sort of a problem. So when the English monarchy comes into being in the 18th century, comes into its own, it takes a very hostile view of not just Celtic paganism or localism, but really of anything indigenous that wasn't Hanoverian.
Yeah.
So there's this, so there's a sort of English austerity relationship in those early years that they tended towards science and maybe even Dutch customs. It's hard to describe, but in Ireland, because of that sort of Greece to Rome relationship, that sort of defeated, broken relationship, it lends itself to imagination and to lament, and these become qualities that the English recognize in Ireland.
And for the benefit of listeners, when you say Greece to Rome, you're seeing Ireland in the place of Greece and what was the British Empire in those days in the position of Rome.
Yeah, like any Joycean or fan of Braveheart.
I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting you say that about Braveheart, because obviously we then had, in the 18th century, the English were not only being beastly to the Irish, as they had been for several hundred years, but also being beastly to the Highlanders, with the Bonnie Prince Charlie's revolt being crushed and the Highland clans being broken after that. But 100 years on, we have Queen Victoria and this whole revival in interest in chivalry and the interest in the Scottish clans and wearing of kilts and tartans. And obviously, Queen Victoria had her main holiday home, if you like, up at Balmoral in the Highlands. So, we seem to sort of got over it quite quickly, or we seem to have reinvented the Highlands as a bit of an interesting theme park, having ruthlessly crushed the originals 100 years previously.
Yes, it's very interesting. There's both Scotland and Ireland have a very influential role in what Victorianism would become. So, as you described with Scotland, there's also Walter Scott becomes prime minister. Yeah. But Victoria's occultist was actually William Wilde, the father of Oscar Wilde. And as the occultist, he sort of played the same role that the Irish had played to the English in the days of Dee to Queen Elizabeth. And also Kelly, the Magi, who was an Irishman also. Yeah, it's a very interesting. But William Wilde is a very interesting figure because as an Irish Gaelic scholar, he was influential in helping the Victorians to interpret the archaeological discoveries that were happening at the time. For example, the Tara brooch was discovered in Ireland and with great fanfare was included in the Great Exhibition as a centerpiece. And there was also the rise of amongst the British aristocracy in I think trying to claim a legitimacy that the Hanoverians had problems promoting with the Stuart continuance.
Yeah.
They started fantasizing about British Israelism, which would also suit the rise of the Jewish banking families in England at the time also. So to facilitate that, they searched out the philology of Celtic studies, which meant reading the Irish manuscripts, as was happening in Germany with Kuno Myers and these other Celtic scholars, and that's became the source material for a lot of that view that the lost tribe of Zedekiah came with the prophet Jeremiah to with his daughter Taya to Ireland years ago, and this whole very elaborate story became part of their interest in Celtic stuff. But in Ireland, that wasn't the interest. The interest was in surviving and reclaiming the country.
Yeah.
So there was the same material, but two very different purposes.
Yeah. How do you, when you're talking about paganism and the like in Celtic origins in Ireland, how does that pan out with Catholicism? Because in England, the perception has always been
Catholicism
that Ireland is totally Catholic and very rigid. Obviously, exception for Ulster in the north with Protestantism, but that basically the what is the Irish Republic now has always been this papist Irish Catholic stronghold linked to Rome, and nothing whatsoever to do with anything else. How do those sides reconcile?
Well, there's two Irish Catholicisms. There's a pre-famine Irish Catholicism, which is very pagan in that the history of Christianity in Europe is very elaborately oriented in Ireland from the days of the Church Fathers in Anatolia, or what's today Turkey.
Yeah.
At the very same time, Ireland was the sort of Western style Christianity, which is very different than so Irish Christianity, or the Celtic Church as it's known, is the progenitor of vernacular languages, not just the Irish language, but also the beginnings of, as the Venerable Bede would describe, the English language, but also German, Polish. The first writers of those languages, these vernacular or pagan languages, were Irish monks that would spread out from Ireland as though it were ironically, a source of Christianity. So yes. that Celtic Church in many ways represents the old pagan, mythological-minded Dark Ages, they call it, but it's actually the most imaginative era of European thinking and storytelling and mythos, and every village in Europe has a strange story about a saint that floated or explored the depths of the underworld. All very pagan and Celtic in its imagination. But then there's the post-famine Catholic Church, which was a virulent form of it was called a Jansenism, which was a Dutch style. It wasn't really Irish. It was really the Romans were able to get a much stronger foothold in Ireland after the famine, and they created a very abusive form of Catholicism there. So there's a struggle in Irish Catholicism between that older Celtic Church, where the locals will go to the Holy Well and perform customs that are pagan or Celtic through the mode of a Celtic saint that wouldn't even be recognized by the Roman Church. And that was the authentic Irish Catholicism. And then that new form that came in the 1860s was really a Roman, you could say, a deal with the British Empire. Really, that is ironically, it was used as a repressive force against the rise of the other post-famine phenomenon was Fenianism, which was a Celtic revivalism in its own right, because it's reviving the god, or the warrior god, Finn McCool, as a revolutionary force. But the Catholic Church was used often by the British aristocracy to clamp down on that style of fight back, and it was through this austere, sort of Victorian parody Catholicism, which it could be called Papist, but it would be unfamiliar up until the famine.
Right. I hadn't appreciated that, as obviously having an education in the UK, in England, Ireland isn't mentioned except for the Irish problem and votes for Ireland, etc. in the late 19th century. The whole era from Queen Elizabeth onwards is just nothing there. We don't have anything about that in our history classes.
Yeah, it's a shame, because the two traditions, just like you can't really understand England without France. You can't really understand Ireland without England, and you really can't understand England without Ireland, however, which is maybe not so appreciated, but it really does take, so much of English history pivots on events in Ireland, such as the Battle of the Boyne, the 19th century emancipation movement came out of Ireland, and that would have drastic effects on the future of English society. The Irish Party was always a pivot in Westminster, and really would affect the rise of liberalism in English politics, as well as the labor movement. So it's it's an unfortunate severance of understanding between not just England and Ireland, but really the nations of Europe, how they relate to each other.
And, going back to your comments about the earlier pre-famine Catholic Church, of course, you've got the situation where, as you were saying about the saints, is it St. Bridget is basically a Catholic remarketing, if you like, of an old pagan goddess, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And she's also the origin, it shows you the Celtic origins of the English language, for example, that her name as a goddess is also the origin of the English word for breed, and the notion of kinship and regeneration and birth. That's a connected term.
Are there any other Celtic deities that later became rebranded as Catholic saints besides Bridget?
There are. I will think about that. But I thought you were asking another question. I'll answer that one if you don't mind for a sec.
Yes.
There's in English. There's a word. Thank you. You reminded me of it when you were speaking there. The English have a term is called when you want to insult someone, you'll call them a big lug, and it's the English belittlement of the old Celtic god Lu or Lug. But ironically, Lug Lu was a continental wide Celtic god. And his name is at the root of many place names across Europe, such as in Lyon, in France, but also London, which is very interesting. The original name of London was Lugdunum, which in Celtic means the fortress of the god Lu or Lug. So you have that. But in the Celtic saints, but there's none that come to mind that would have been a direct god.
Right.
Bridget was transformed, I think, because of this sense of Irish kinship through the mother. The need is there to ensure that the goddess of the incorporated people doesn't become another religion. So she had to be incorporated as a saint. But the same might have happened with the Celtic god Dahida, who would have been the paternal god. The name Saint Patrick, it means basically father. So if Dada means father, the idea that the main saint of the Irish would mean father also, as in pater, or
Yes.
is it's in keeping. It's in
Yes.
keeping. Some of Saint Patrick's accoutrements, such as his staff, would be analogous to the weapons that Dahida would be associated with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I'll just finish. This one little point is that the Holy Grail is a very famous transposition of Celtic material into Christian mode, so that the holy cup would have been in Celtic mythology the cauldron of everlasting life.
Yeah.
And so the evolution of the mythos of the Last Supper really happens through the Celtic storytelling from the Northern Church about the stories that the Church Fathers from Anatolia would be telling. You'd find that a lot of that Arthurian or a Holy Grail feeling, which we associate with Western Christianity, is not what the early church in Rome was like. And I think a lot of that comes from the Celts. So also the monkish costumes. For example, the hooded monk is very much a Celtic costume. In fact, the Vatican comes from the old Latin word vates, which means druid. The ovates was the English word. When Caesar was conquering Gaul, he called the priesthood of the Gauls or the Celts the vates, and very arguably that's the origin of the word Vatican.
I hadn't realised that. That's fascinating. That and. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, it's in keeping with your point of how much of the Christian overlay is actually pagan or Celtic, and I think quite a bit, actually.
We'll be continuing that interview with Brendan Keane in our next show.
You are listening to the Weird Tales Radio Show with Charles Christian on internet radio and podcast.
That's it. We're almost out of time, but there's just room to squeeze in one final story. And this is a weird one in a distinctly WTF way, because we're looking at another infamous event in the social history of New York City, namely the Straw Hat Riot of 1922. Yes, I did say Straw Hat Riot. It seems that during the early years of the 20th century, the straw hat, particularly straw boaters, were considered acceptable day attire for North American cities in the height of the summer, even for businessmen. But there was an unwritten rule that no one was supposed to wear a straw hat past the 15th of September. This rule, incidentally, did not apply to women's hats. Although the date is totally arbitrary, if any man was seen wearing a straw hat, he was, at the least, subjecting himself to ridicule, and it was a tradition for youths to knock straw hats off wearers' heads and to stomp on them. This tradition became so well established that newspapers of the day would often warn people of the impending approach of the 15th, so men could get ready to switch over to their felt or silk hats. The riot itself began on the 13th of September 1922, 2 days before the supposed unspoken date, when a group of youths decided to get an early jump on the tradition. This group began in the former Mulberry Bend area of Manhattan by removing and stomping hats worn by factory workers who were employed in the area. The more innocuous stomping turned into a brawl when the youths tried to stomp on a group of dock workers' hats, and the dock workers, not surprisingly, fought back. The brawl soon stopped traffic on the Manhattan Bridge and was eventually broken up by the police, leading to some arrests. Although the initial brawl was broken up by the police, the fights continued to escalate during that evening and over the next couple of days, with gangs of teenagers prowling the streets wielding large sticks, looking for pedestrians wearing hats and beating those who resisted them. One man claimed his hat was taken by youths who belonged to a mob of about 1,000 people that was snatching hats all along the Amsterdam Avenue. Several men were hospitalised from the beatings they received after resisting having their straw hats taken, and many arrests were made. The police were slow to respond to the riots initially, although several off-duty police officers found themselves caught up in the brawl when rioters attempted to snatch their straw hats. The disturbances lasted a total of 8 days, however most of those arrested got off with a fine and only a handful were jailed, and then only for a few days. Innocent times when there was nothing more important to cause a riot on the streets than men wearing straw boater hats out of season. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon,
which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist.icloud.com or on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.